Hello, today I'd like to show you how to marzipan a cake that's going to be royal iced. And we're going to do this in two sections. We're going to do the top first and then we're going to do the sides. The reason for that is that we need a very nice sharp edge to the cake so that when we coat the cake in royal icing, then that in turn will have a very nice sharp edge. So I'm looking at my cake's quite level. I'll just turn it over to check. There's different ways I can check. I can use a spirit level, or I can use a spirit level on phone, or I can get down and just look to turn the cake, look to see if it's level, and that's fine. I'm turning it back again because I'm actually going to marzipan the top of this cake. I'll put it to one side. The equipment I've got is a rolling pin, pastry brush, palette knife, smoother, sharp knife, icing sugar, apricot jam, a cake board, and my marzipan. Okay, so if my cake needed to be trimmed, I could use the knife just to trim this off. But I don't want to lose any height, so it's looking fine actually. It's going down a little bit there, but I'll show you how to correct that. I'm not too worried if the odd currant is missing. I'm not worried about that because we won't see it at the end. I've got my marzipan. Now, when you marzipan a cake for a royal iced cake, we've got to be really careful of the oil. So we don't need to release the oil in the marzipan. So all I'm doing is pushing it together. I'm not going to knead it. The more I knead the marzipan, the more the oil will be released and the oil will come through the royal icing and mark it. And I'm going to use just over, I'll say 2/3 of the marzipan for the top. Now the top of the cake needs to look the best, but what you've got to be really careful of is cake crumbs. So if you've got any cake crumbs, please take those out, because again, those cake crumbs will release the oil and the oil will come through the royal icing. So I'm checking I've got nothing on my hands, no crumbs on my hands, none on my apron, and definitely none on the table. Okay, so I'm just gently pushing the marzipan together and into a ball, because it's a round cake. Roll it out in icing sugar. So, as you can see, I'm rolling the marzipan and turning it. And I keep rolling and turning. Now, the reason I'm turning the marzipan is so that it will be nice and flat. If I start rolling like this, then I'll put more pressure on one side than the other. So I'm putting equal pressure on my hands, rolling it and turning it. The other reason I'm turning it is so that it doesn't stick to the table. Keep an eye on the shape of your marzipan, and you just want that nice round look. Now the top of the marzipan is going to be thicker than the sides. Now the reason for that is when you cut a cake, and the other way, you don't want an end piece with a thick lump of marzipan on the side. You want it presented with a nice amount of marzipan on top for only a small amount on the side. So I'll just show you the thickness. Okay. Now that's my best side of the marzipan, the one I've rolled. This one will not be as good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that over, and you can see I've put some icing sugar on the table to prevent it sticking. Now whatever size cake you've got, it's exactly the same technique. So my nice side is towards the table and my rougher side is uppermost. What I'm now going to do is go and boil my apricot jam. My apricot jam needs to be bubbling all over. Okay, so I've boiled my apricot jam and I'm using it straight away. I'm putting a small amount on my brush and I'm going to brush the top of the cake. It's not a thick layer, it's only, the purpose of it is to stick the marzipan to the cake. Now what I'm going to do is lift the cake and I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to place it onto the marzipan. And I'm just checking that it's moving. You put your hand flat on the cake, and if you know, lots of people have a gap between the marzipan and the cake at this stage, and I'm just going to push a little bit of marzipan into the gap. And you can see every time I push it in, I'm then getting into a good habit of turning the cake. Now this cake is quite flat, although it has got, I've spotted one gap, but I'm just going round, pushing the marzipan into the gaps just to make sure. And you can see that I've done it all the way around. Using your palette knife, you reach over the cake so that's the side that's furthest away from you, because my eyesight is looking down, and I'm going to cut that off and I'm going to turn it. So my palette knife is against the cake. I'm making sure that that's nice and level. And each time I do it, I'm turning the cake again. So just to make sure that it's free of the table, it's not sticking. You can see I'm looking over the top of the cake, and I'm doing it in the same spot each time. Just before you lift it off, just do double take to check that that marzipan is nice and level. Again, if you cut it in like this, what will happen, the marzipan will go in and then you'll need to start again. Lift it up and turn it round. So you can see I've got that thickness of marzipan on the top. And I'm just checking I've got no crumbs on top as well, because as I say, I don't want any crumbs. Pop that to one side. This marzipan can be used again, but do what I'm doing. Check for any crumbs, because we don't need the crumbs to go on the outside of the marzipan. If you was in full production and you had sugar paste cakes and dry ice cakes to do, you'd do all the dry ice cakes first, and then you would use all the bits that are left over that may have crumbs in it to marzipan your sugar paste cakes. And that way there'd be no wastage, so all this wastage here would be used. There we go. I'm just getting rid of all those crumbs. Really important, as you go through this cake, get rid of your crumbs. And just push any crumbs off that you might have. And again, I'm checking my apron, I'm checking my hands as I go. Okay, so I'm just pushing together the marzipan. I'm not necessarily kneading the marzipan, I'm not going to release those oils. I want it into a sausage shape. If you find your marzipan, if you're using marzipan cake on a cold day, your marzipan's a little bit on the stick side, then all you need to do is just pop it in the microwave for a little bit, or place it next to the oven just to warm up. And you can see I've got a strip of marzipan. Now this marzipan needs to be finer than the top, so rolled out a little bit thinner. And I'm checking the height to see if I've got the right height. That's fine. I've got a little bit of almond there. No, that's not a cake. I'm still removing it just in case. But then going to roll, and you can see my hand is in the middle. I'm not rolling that way in case I put more pressure on one side than the other. I'm just going to put pressure in the middle of the marzipan as I go. And you'll see through habit, I'm constantly moving the marzipan around. So we're after a piece of marzipan that's the right level, that's the right height. I'm not too worried about the length. If it is a little bit short, I'll show you how to place a section in. What you need to do is use a palette knife. I'm cutting off the bottom edge. That's nice and level. I'm cutting off the ends. Just checking if that's the right height. And I'm going to cut off this end as well. Now that's the part that's nice. This is the part that's a little bit rough. So I want that on the outside of my cake. I'm now going to put some icing sugar on, just a small amount, and I'm going to roll it up. So that's for the side. Put my cake over. Apricot jam onto the side of the cake to attach the marzipan. Now I've got to be really careful with this because I only want the apricot jam on the bottom ridge of that top layer. If my apricot jam comes up, then I could risk that showing through my royal icing. So just making sure the apricot jam is all over the cake. And you can see I've got a few holes. I'm not worried about that at all. And I'm just bringing up the apricot jam onto the bottom part of that marzipan. Okay, I'm moving it away from this table here because that's where I've got some jam. So I'm bringing it here. Making sure I've got no crumbs on my hands. Take the marzipan around and I'm making sure that it's touching the table as I go. Brilliant. I'm pleased that's not gone all the way around because I want to show you how to patch it. Okay. Now if it does go all the way around, that's fine. You just make sure it's cut off level. But I'm going to roll out some marzipan to fit in that gap. So the same level of marzipan. So what you do, you butt it up, so you put it together, you don't overlap it, you put it together. And then using a palette knife or a knife, I'm just going to run the palette knife along that edge. And I want it to butt in, again not overlapping. So that's quite a good example of what to do if your marzipan doesn't go all the way around the edge. I'm sure you will. You as well. So that's level, that's no problem. What I need to do now is get rid of this top edge. So I'm using a clean palette knife and I'm just wiping it with a cloth to make sure it is clean. I've got no jam on there, I've got no crumbs on there. And it doesn't matter where I start, I'm just going to cut in. And I'm going to cut along that edge, and it joins up the marzipan, the side marzipan to the top. So I'm going to scrape in. Here again. So I'll take the palette knife and I'll scrape into the cake. So I'm joining the marzipan up from the side of the top. please, when you do this, you be aware that this edge here needs to be nice and sharp. Don't start rubbing it as so you would do with a sugar paste cake. What you can do is use a smoother, and you can smooth nice and gently around. But please hold the palette, the smoother straight. Don't hold it out or in, because your cake won't come the right shape. So that goes around there. I can always just very gently do the top. You probably don't need it, and you'd never ever touch that. So I'm looking at the cake, looking for any imperfections. I'm looking to see whether it's nice and level, nice and straight, whether there's any gaps, and looking for those cake crumbs as well. So I'm going to attach it to the board with just a small amount of royal icing, and that will hold it still while I coat the cake. Put your palette knife underneath your cake, put your hand underneath, lift it up, take your hand away, take the palette knife away, and check that the cake is in the centre of your board. Just get turntable. So we can look at the cake all the way around. So you can see I've got a little bit of a gap there, so I need to get rid of that. Can you see the gap? And especially where I've put the palette knife in here. Now the reason I need to get rid of the gap, because when I coat the cake, my royal icing will go into that gap. Then the cake holds a lot of grease, and that's why I've been looking for the cake crumbs as well. So cake crumbs and the cake hold a lot of grease because you've put butter in them. And then what will happen, that will then affect the royal icing, so the grease will come out onto the royal icing and stain the royal icing a brown. If I've got any cake crumbs on my cake, it will do exactly the same, it'll stain the royal icing. So all I need to do with the smoother is just ease down that marzipan until it touches the board. Okay, come there, take it off. So that's fine. I'm going to measure the cake. I'm just going to use my palette knife, but you can use a ruler. And I'm going to measure to see if it's in the centre of the board, and you can see that it's not there, so I need to move it slightly. And I want to do this now because that royal icing will hold onto the cake and I won't be able to move it, or I won't be able to move it as easily. There we go. So that's how you marzipan a cake for royal icing. Thank you.